This is, of course, where one of the most important events of the American Revolution took place. That's the Battle of Bunker Hill. In fact, the Bunker Hill Monument is right behind me. And we'll talk about Bunker Hill in just a minute. I want to talk about some of the other things we did today. We did a good chunk of the Freedom Trail today. We went to Faneuil Hall. We walked over and took a duck boat tour, which the duck boats are amazing. These are World War II style boats that were useful because they could be both on land and, of course, on the water. And so that's what made them so useful in World War II. But anyway, as far as here in Boston, for the last 30 years or so, you've been able to take these duck boat tours. And we heard about this from our tour guide yesterday. And we also had a little fun incident with it we talked about in the video yesterday. And so we decided, hey, let's do a duck boat tour ourselves, especially because, you know what, the feet, after all these days, they could use a little bit of an easier day. And so the duck boat was great for that. Took us around to see many of the different sites. We got to see, of course, things like the old State House, and we got to see the newer State House, which is still pretty old, but newer than the old State House. And we saw a lot of the other sites, Boston City Hall, which has been voted a number of times the ugliest building in the world. It's kind of ugly. It's that, brutal style of architecture. But anyway, and especially compared to everything else here that's so great. It's not my thing. But anyway, what's cool about the duck boat is after we kind of went through the Beacon Hill neighborhood, that's when we were able to enter the Charles River, which it's kind of a cool thing. You hear about it, but it's cool to actually do it, going from the land into the water. And we got to see some parts of the Charles River. We got to go under a bridge there. And on the other side of the Charles River from Boston is, of course, Cambridge, which is where MIT and Harvard are both located. So places that I did not go to school. But anyway, and then got to come back and have that transition back from the water onto the land. That was kind of a fun little thing, the duck boat, as well as getting a lot of interesting information. Our tour guide was a major Beatles fan. He called himself not Sergeant Pepper. What was it? Private Pepper or something? Anyway, he was wearing a Sergeant Pepper-esque outfit, his garb, and it was just everything he said was a Beatles pun, it seemed. It was quite impressive, the number of Beatles puns he had, and for myself as a huge Beatles fan, it was quite enjoyable to listen to all the Beatles puns. I think some of the other people probably enjoyed it less than I did. That's okay, though. So anyway, duck boat tour, totally fun, especially have a day where you are able to take a little bit of the a load off of the feet and be able to drive around and see a lot of the sights of Boston. So anyway, from the duck boat tour, we continued along the Freedom Trail, and we went to the Paul Revere House. We got to go inside that, and that was really neat. They don't let you take pictures inside, but we did take some pictures from outside, and it was cool to see. They did have some of the actual artifacts and some of the furniture that did belong to the Revere family within the house, and that was awesome. And from there, we got to see the famous Paul Revere statue by Cyrus Dallin. He's a very famous sculptor who sculpted a lot of interesting things. Some of the things that we saw down in Plymouth were sculpted by Cyrus Dallin. And then, of course, the Angel Moroni on the Salt Lake Temple was sculpted by Cyrus Dallin. So great sculptor, and a very famous equestrian sculpture of Paul Revere on his Midnight Ride. And of course, Paul Revere is most famous for the Midnight Ride, but maybe more importantly, he's the one that did the famous engraving of the Boston Massacre, where he basically makes the British look like they were firing, on purpose, on orders, massacring innocent people, which is not really how the Boston Massacre played out, but that's how the Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, that's how they wanted it portrayed, and they were using it as a propaganda tool, and it was very effective. In any event, after seeing that Paul Revere statue, we saw the Old North Church, which we went inside yesterday, so we didn't spend as much time there, but we walked past the Old North Church. We went to the Copp's Hill Burying Ground. One of the most interesting things about that, beside it being, of course, a very old burying ground, is you have many of those that participated in the Boston Tea Party are actually buried in that cemetery. So that was an interesting thing to see. And then we crossed the bridge. It's a bit of a hike across the bridge over here to the Charlestown Peninsula, which is directly north of Boston proper. And it was here on the Charlestown Peninsula. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. We went and saw the USS Constitution, which was commissioned in 1797. It is the oldest commissioned warship, for sure U.S., but I think maybe even in the world. Not 100% sure on that. Look that up, and then you'll know. But anyway, it's still U.S. Navy. It's still, manned by U.S. Navy personnel on the ship. And it was used extensively in the War of 1812. That's where it got its nickname, Old Ironsides. Of course, the U.S. Constitution has been a part of the U.S. Navy ever since 1797. Quite a long time. Anyway, and then we made our way up to this monument here at Bunker Hill, which technically is Breed's Hill. Okay. The Battle of Bunker Hill is kind of maybe slightly misnamed. It probably should be called the Battle of Breed's Hill, although the Battle of Bunker Hill is another hill over here on the Charlestown Peninsula, and it factored into the battle a bit, but it's not where the bulk of the fighting took place. Somehow the names kind of got switched up in history, and it's been known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. This is, of course, a hugely important battle, just about exactly 2 months after Lexington and Concord. In those 2 months, you have about 20,000 militiamen who have surrounded Boston by land. The British control the sea, they control the harbor, but it's by land that the British are, not trapped in Boston, but they're certainly blocked from leaving Boston by land. And this militia has gathered, and they're just kind of waiting there and biding their time and trying to figure out what to do next. There's no real central leadership, which is an issue. You have a militia from all over New England that has come to surround Boston. So anyway, 2 months after Lexington and Concord, some of these militiamen go and set up fortifications on Breed's Hill. One of the leaders of this is Colonel Prescott. He's the one who famously says to the men, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." Maybe not. Probably didn't actually say it, but that's what they say that he said, and it's a great line, and it helps to illustrate part of the idea of why he would possibly have said that, although probably not. And that is, of course, that they were very low on ammunition. They had built some great fortifications up here, makeshift, but well done at the top of the hill. They have the high ground, which is important, of course. The British can't let them have this fortified position on high ground overlooking Boston Harbor, overlooking Boston itself. The potential is bad of getting some guns up there where they could potentially hit British ships, or the British can't have it. So the plan is to come over and to take the hill. It ends up taking a lot more men than the British expect. It takes 3 charges up the hill, about 3,000 men, which is not what the British anticipated they would need in this battle. The fighting was much more intense than they expected. They certainly didn't expect these colonials to stand up to them, the greatest army in the world, in the way that they did. The Americans, the colonials, have maybe 2,400-ish to the 3,000 British. They have a better position, but again, they don't have the ammunition they need, and they slowly but surely run out of ammunition, and that's the end of it for them. They try to escape off the hill. Most of them get away. One very important American, who I think is one of the underappreciated founding fathers, is a man by the name of Joseph Warren, who was a doctor in Boston. He has been leading a lot of what has happened up to this point. He was instrumental in leading the effort to get the word out to the colonial militias in the countryside for Lexington and Concord. He was a good friend of Paul Revere's, and he was killed, and there was a fight for his body up here in the battle. There's a very famous painting that indicates that. And the story goes that his body was very much mistreated and thrown into a common grave by the British once they took the position up here. And that then his body was that it was identified by Paul Revere, who was a dentist and was able to use his knowledge of Dr. Warren's, you know, dental records, I guess we would say today. That's how he was able to identify his body and give him a proper burial elsewhere. That's, or so the story goes. In any event, the Battle of Bunker Hill is hugely important in the American Revolution. It shows that the colonials can stand up to the British and that they're not going to back down in this fight. It's what we would call a Pyrrhic victory for the British. They do technically win the battle, but their casualty numbers are extremely high. And it's pretty much the end of General Gage as being in charge here in Boston. The numbers are, you know, of their 3,000, you've got about 1,050 casualties for the British. About 200 plus of those are dead. On the side of the colonials, it's less than half that number, about 450 casualties, and only just over 100 dead of those casualties. So yes, it's a victory for the British, but they know, and the colonials know, that one of the main reasons for the victory for the British was just because the colonials didn't have enough ammunition. Had they had enough ammunition, they may have been able to hold that position much longer, and perhaps the British would have had to retreat and try again another day. And so this is a psychologically, it's a blow for the British. In some ways, it's not good for the colonials. It maybe gives them, they become a bit overconfident due to this battle. But it's not surprising that a month later, it's felt that there's a need to have some real leadership, some central leadership in the Continental Congress. In July of 1775, a month after the battle, the Congress appoints George Washington as the head of the new Continental Army. And Washington comes here and has to find a way to organize these 20,000 ragtag militiamen, which is quite a feat. And it's one of the most impressive things that Washington really does as leader, is finding a way to turn this mess that he walks into a real fighting force. And it takes some time. It takes years really before they can stand up to a British army on a battlefield. But it's a great effort by George Washington, and it's part of what makes him a great leader. So anyway, I know I've talked a long time, but I find this fascinating. And the Battle of Bunker Hill, of course, is one of the most important events of the American Revolution. And when you come to Boston, it's the kind of the tail end of the Freedom Trail. Although we did talk about this, maybe it's smarter to start at Bunker Hill and work your way the other way, because then your walk is mostly downhill instead of uphill. Although it's really not bad. It's not horribly uphill. It's not the tallest hill in the world or anything. But this obelisk that was created here, it was actually started in 1825 for the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And one of the interesting things is the Marquis de Lafayette was on his famous tour of America 50 years, after the beginning of the Revolution, and he helped lay the cornerstone. Although apparently they ended up moving it to a different spot when they got serious about building it. Where they put the cornerstone, they realized maybe it wasn't the best place for the monument. And then the monument was built. It took 18 years, so it's not until 1843 that it is completed. But some might say, hey, it's just a copy of the Washington Monument, right? That's where you'd be wrong. The Washington Monument is not as old as this monument. And you could really make the argument that it's all just a copy of the Egyptians, because this form here, you see the obelisk is an old Egyptian thing. But anyway, it does look a lot like the Washington Monument, but the Washington Monument's construction began 5 years after the completion of this Bunker Hill Memorial. And of course, it's not as tall as the Washington Monument, but it's still quite impressive, and definitely a sight worth seeing when you come to Boston.